start talking about the last part of this chapter, and that is, how do all organisms use this glucose that's so important? Plants are going to make up, producers are going to make up the bottom of a food chain. Why is that? They have the ability to make glucose, and all organisms can use that glucose to make ATP. Now, I do want to remind you that ATP is adenosine, one of the nucleotides, with 3 phosphates attached to it. And when we remove this phosphate, we can use that energy to do something in the cell, metabolism. So respiration, cellular respiration, is the process of getting energy from glucose, transferring the energy that was originally from the sun in the bonds of glucose into the bonds of an ATP, that third phosphate. It's called cellular respiration, and respiration might make you think of breathing. We all have a respiration rate. It's one of our vital signs. But this respiration is not the same as breathing, but it is the reason we need to breathe. We breathe in order to get oxygen, and we need oxygen so that we can do cellular respiration, which is to get the energy from glucose and transfer it to ATP. There are 2 major types of respiration. They are aerobic and anaerobic. They both get energy from glucose molecules to make ATP. Aerobic is the most efficient way. You can do it with oxygen and mitochondria, but that's not always an option for cells, as we'll get into later. So there's also an anaerobic way to do it. You're still getting energy from glucose to make ATP. You can't make as much ATP, but you still get enough to stay alive for these particular organisms. And you may remember this from our discussions as fermentation. So anaerobic respiration is also called fermentation. So if we look at the chemical equation for photosynthesis, we know that, again, we're not using all the complicated chemical formulas we did in class, but we basically have sugar, which I would have written as C6H12O6, and oxygen are going to combine to give you carbon dioxide and water. In addition to that, what you see up here, the matter, the energy that's in the sugar, some of it, is going to be transferred to the energy that's in ATP. So we said ATP was like a charged battery. And if we took that phosphate off, it released energy, and that released energy was going to do some work for the cell. That would leave us with a phosphate and an ADP. And then we were going to put that phosphate back on the ADP to recharge the battery. We needed the energy, and this energy comes from glucose. So let's start with aerobic. Aerobic is the most complicated way, but it's also the most efficient way to get ATPs from glucose. And this can be done in organisms that live in an environment with oxygen and have mitochondria. So they have to have that internal cell organelle, the mitochondria. If you do, you get the most ATP from glucose. And we've stuck with the number 36. You'll see estimates around 36 to 38 in your careers and your futures. But it's about that. And there are 3 steps to complete aerobic respiration. The first step is glycolysis. The second one is the Krebs cycle. And the third one is electron transport. So let's go through those steps one at a time. So we start with glycolysis. In glycolysis, you're just splitting the glucose in 2. So if we look at a chemical equation, we're at C6H12O6, which is glucose, is going to be broken down into 2 C3H6O3s. And when you break that bond holding the carbons together, carbon 3 and 4 in glucose, you get 2 ATPs. You get enough energy released to make 2 ATPs. So if we look at a diagram, we have carbons represented by circles. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. We're going to break that bond, and we'll have 2 molecules that are 3 carbons, and those are going to become pyruvic acids. In the process, we had to use 2 ATP, and we made 4 ATP, which is why we say you can get 2 ATPs out of this. You get a gain of ATPs just by doing glycolysis. Those pyruvates are then going to go to the Krebs cycle. And each pyruvate is going to be broken down to carbon dioxides. So each pyruvate was a C3H6O3. We're going to make 3 carbon dioxides and 3 waters. Now, you know there's a lot of intermediate steps in the way here, that you don't just break one carbon off, break another carbon off, break another carbon off. It goes through the Krebs cycle, the citric acid cycle. You get citric acid and a bunch of other intermediates, oxaloacetic acid at the end. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but we don't have to overcomplicate it either. Through this process, we're going to generate 3 carbon dioxides. We're going to make 2 ATPs directly. There's one here, and we do this twice because we have 2 pyruvates. But what we do have a lot of are high energy electrons. Now, you don't see high energy electrons written on this diagram anywhere. What you have to think of is these molecules, NADH and FADH2, are carrying high energy electrons. So in glycolysis, we made 2 ATPs. In the Krebs cycle, we made 2 ATPs. We've broken down all the glucose. The glucose is gone. It's gone back into the atmosphere in the form of CO2 that plants can use to rebuild glucose. But we can take those high energy electrons being carried by NADH and FADH2 to the electron transport system. And here, the high energy electrons are going to power the manufacturing of ATP. Now, they do need an oxygen at the last step. Right here, that electron is passed from cytochrome to cytochrome until it goes to oxygen. And when it goes to oxygen, it goes back to become water. And water was what we broke down in photosynthesis to get oxygen. So we're going to go through the electron transport chain, and this is where we're going to get most of our ATP. So we've gone through glycolysis, split the sugar in 2. We've taken that products of that, pyruvates, and broken each carbon-carbon bond in them, releasing carbon dioxide. And we've created high energy electrons, and we're going to use the energy in those electrons to make ATPs. And with all of the oxygen present, with the mitochondria, we can do that and get about 36 ATPs. So this is the most efficient mechanism. This is the mechanism that is used by all multicellular organisms. It's used by some single-celled organisms. In order for it to be useful, the organisms have to live in environments with oxygen, and they must have mitochondria. They must be eukaryotic organisms. This process uses glucose, whether it's glucose that you had to eat because you're a consumer, or whether it's glucose that you could produce because you're an autotroph or a producer. And it also uses oxygen. So that is not always possible. Sometimes parts of a body can't get enough oxygen fast enough to keep up with ATP production in this way. That's why we get tired muscles. And when we do that, when we run into that situation, for a short period of time, we can do lactic acid fermentation. So the glucose would be broken down into 2 pyruvates. That's glycolysis. We do that all the time. All organisms do that to begin with. And then those pyruvates, instead of being broken down into 3 carbon dioxides in the Krebs cycle, are going to be changed to lactate or lactic acid. And that lactic acid is going to leave the cell, and that will allow glycolysis, this part, to give us a couple of ATPs to continue in the absence of the Krebs cycle and electron transport. There are other organisms that don't have mitochondria, or they live in environments that don't have oxygen. In this case, they are going to use a different form of fermentation, alcohol fermentation. And alcohol fermentation will take over, and now the glucose will be, through glycolysis, turned into 2 pyruvates. And the pyruvates, instead of becoming a 3-carbon lactic acid, will become a 2-carbon ethanol and a 1-carbon carbon dioxide. Now, if you are making alcohol or spirits, you're going to collect the ethanol. If you're trying to get bread to rise, you're more concerned about the carbon dioxide that it's given off, because that's how bread will rise. So in conclusion, all organisms use the glucose, and mostly only glucose, to make ATP. So all organisms use ATP to carry out metabolism. The metabolism in plants might be a little different than it is in animals. The metabolism in humans might be a little different than it is in other animals. But that metabolism is all powered by ATPs. And this is why producers are going to form the basis of all food chains. Producers are the only organisms that can make glucose. Even though all organisms need glucose to make ATP, only producers, autotrophs, plants, plant-like organisms, can make that glucose to make ATP. And it's this relationship that's going to set up the ways that organisms interact with each other in the environments. And that's what we will move on to in the next chapter. Monday I will, or depending on which class you're in, next class I will post chalk talk of this and a quick formative for this. And then following that, we're going to move to another chapter. And that will be back to more of a format that you're used to. All right. Have a good weekend. This is Friday.